Hello and welcome to week 11. Can you believe it? We can't. We were just discussing that. This week we're discussing Alfred North Whitehead's The Aims of Education. And we think this will be so interesting because it connects with previous readings, the ideas of Mill and Locke and Rousseau. And so we think this will be lots of fun to talk about. We hope that you've had a good time reading it.
We have. We sure have. So just a little bit of background as usual. Alfred North Whitehead lived from 1861 to 1947. If you just think for a second, things that were happening during that time period. We have the American Civil War. We have World War I and World War II. We have the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression. I mean, the invention of
the automobile,
the car,
the
light bulb. Massive, massive changes. So like us again, he was living in a world full of change. His background is in math. He was a mathematician, went to school at Oxford and Cambridge, and I think maybe just Cambridge, and became a professor in England, and then toward the end of his life became a professor at Harvard University in Massachusetts. And he had wide-ranging interests. So as a mathematician, he was interested in logic, and that led him to an interest in education. And toward the end of his life, again, he was trying to pull together an overarching philosophy to make sense of the world that he lived in. And this philosophy he came up with is called process philosophy, which recognizes the fundamental reality of change and is aimed at equipping people with the resources, with the skills and mental resources to be able to deal with change and find meaning in constant change. And so that's sort of the background that's underlying this text that we're reading, which is from the middle of his life, the 1920s, I believe, is when he wrote this essay. It was a collection of speeches that he gave, actually, that was later published as a book. And so as an educator, he has, intimate knowledge of education systems, specifically in England at the time that he was writing this, and really aware of, these questions about what makes an effective education, how people learn, what they need to learn.
I think one of the interesting things about him is he is the first, since Plato, he's the first person whose readings we've read who was actually by profession a teacher.
Yeah, although Wollstonecraft dabbled in it for a while.
Yeah, but she didn't devote her life to it.
No, not especially in a very long life.
Yeah, she didn't live very long.
Yeah, she had a baby.
Who knows what would have happened.
Yeah. So one of the things that he talks about is that he feels like one of the dangers of education is what he calls mental dry rot. So we put a picture of here of real dry rot, which is the decay of wood, and specifically the decay of the timbers that hold together houses and ships. And so that really, those are kind of fundamental.
And the beware of inert ideas I find fascinating because he's saying, what's the quote about a merely well-informed man is the greatest bore
on God's earth, yeah.
Which I like very much, because if you're just packed full of facts, or you're packed full of ideas that don't mean anything to you, then you don't process them, the process philosophy. So I think he's saying you need to have your critical thinking hat on all the time. When you absorb an idea, you need to process it, you need to think it through, and in some way, absorb it and make it yours. Otherwise, the idea is merely inert.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so those inert ideas, he said, are worse than not learning those things at all, because they clutter up our minds and they lead to this sense of disconnection, a whole bunch of half-learned ideas, completely disconnected from each other, that have no usefulness in the way that we make sense of the world. And so he also suggests that we should not try to teach too many subjects or learn too many subjects at once. That and which is interesting, because he's saying to be that is important to be well informed, to be educated, but he really believes in a thorough education. If you're going to learn something, learn it well. And don't learn just enough of it to think that you hate it or to feel like you'll never use it again.
This is taking us a step further than Mill, who says, learn enough to know what you don't know. And now we have Whitehead saying, learn it thoroughly.
Yeah.
Learn it really well.
And we've been talking about this, and we don't think he means that you should try to become an expert on everything, but he really seems to emphasize the importance of gaining expertise in something, and that level, that gaining expertise is going to lead you to a level of wisdom that is not accessible if you are just learning things on a superficial level.
Right. Well, he was somebody that was an expert in many areas.
Yeah.
So he, for us mere mortals who aren't in our 60s yet, I mean, it looks like he took a lifetime to accomplish this, but he was an extraordinary learner himself.
Yeah, and very, very interested in learning. And so the main idea that we're going to talk about from his text here, which I think is going to encompass a lot of his ideas, is this idea of 3 stages of learning. He talks about learning as a rhythmic cycle between freedom and discipline. And I love that idea, that concept that those 2 pieces of learning are essential. You have to have freedom, but you also have to have discipline. And we were talking about the way that encompasses both Rousseau and Locke. That Rousseau emphasized the freedom and Locke emphasized the discipline, but Whitehead brings those ideas together to say, no, that we have a continual back and forth between those 2 things within different stages of learning.
And it's not easy to find that balance, too.
Very difficult.
Yes.
Very difficult. In
There
fact,
is no formula.
you can tell he's a teacher because he keeps saying how hard it is for teachers, how
Yeah.
difficult the teacher's job is to find the right balance, to give students what they need, and that there is no set formula for education, which we recognize well.
So the first stage he talks about is the stage of romance, which he believes is a process of discovery dominated by wonder. So he has that wonderful quote about the teacher sending the student over to the telescope and says that the teacher thinks he's showing the kids the stars, and the kid thinks that they're open to the wonder of the universe. And this is the point. If you're a parent and you've seen your young children just absorbing the world as they grow, this is what he's talking about. The way we are programmed to learn, like eating and digesting food. What you're bringing in becomes part of you on the cellular level, not just something that you pack like a suitcase.
Right. And a good example of this is the way that children learn to speak. That the language becomes an inherent part of who you are, how you see the world, how you process everything around you. This is not some knowledge that you keep in a box in your head and unpack it once in a while to look at it, but it's something that becomes really integral. And so this is part of the stage of romance, that free discovery. He calls it independent browsing amid first-hand experiences. That you're doing it because you want to, because you love learning about new things, even though your learning is going to be incomplete. It's going to be based on the resources that are available to you, but it's driven by love and curiosity and interest.
So is anyone feeling the spirit of Rousseau here? This is a very Rousseauian idea, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think it's interesting that he says all learning needs to start here. And Whitehead says it. He says if it doesn't start here, if you jump right into the next level without this discovery, then he says that that people then become disgusted by a dry imposition of disciplined knowledge. So that you hate it. If you don't have this period of discovery first, then the precision will turn you off. Yeah. And so, but if you have this stage of romance with the emphasis on freedom to explore and learn, then you develop that general knowledge, general interest, and then you're ready for the next step.
So you have a foundation when you move to the stage of precision. And precision is where you start knowing the subject exactly. And it must be fed to you in small doses. You can only learn a little bit of this at a time, which sounds very much like Locke.
Yes. Master very small pieces and then move on to the next one.
And again, this balance between the freedom and the discipline. How much freedom do you give the students to explore their interests, and how much discipline must you impose? And he says you have to have both. And he recognizes that in a schoolroom, that sometimes the training and the discipline can kill the wonder. And he says that's a sad fact, and finding this balance is really, really hard.
Yeah. On the other hand, though, he says that you cannot become an expert without the discipline side. He talks about that there's no such thing as an untutored genius.
Yes.
Right, that it's a vain thing, he says, fondly invented, because we have this image, many of us, I think, of Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci or Albert Einstein or somebody who just somehow sprang fully formed from his parents' head and just automatically knew all these things. But no, they had to pass through the stage of precision. They had to learn the very detailed, tedious, time-consuming habits of their art or of their science in order to become the kind of genius that they became.
But if you have the love for it, if you've gone through that stage of romance, then you're interested. And so going through the stage of precision is something that you enjoy.
Mm-hmm. If it's done right.
If it's done right.
And
yes,
so
and
that,
not killed.
yeah, finding that balance. And again, I mean, as a teacher, as a, a different experience, the thing that I was telling Steph is that really makes me think of music learning, and that, like any kind of learning, have a lot of people that come into it with passion, but then when it starts to become difficult, then some of them lose that passion, although some others they love it enough that they're willing to go through that. And so, yeah, that's that very delicate balance. Because he says this certain ruthless definiteness is essential, that you have to be precise if you're ever going to be good at anything. It's not enough to say, oh, you love that, you want to be a ballet dancer, okay, do it, baby.
Right.
With no training. I mean, you can't. You have to have that precision to be able to become really, really good at something.
And then once you've mastered the precision, mastered the details, then you move on to the stage of generalization, where he says the pupil wants to use his new weapons.
So we put a nice range of weapons here for you. These are apparently all stabbing weapons. Yeah, and those weapons would only be in that area of expertise. But you'd get to the point where the details, the precision has become so much ingrained, you've digested it so well, that that's not what you have to think of anymore.
Because the mind is disciplined. He
Yeah.
says the mind becomes a disciplined regiment instead of a rabble.
Yes.
So that you don't have to be taught how to think. You know how to think. Your mind works very well, very critically, very precisely. And so what you have is this active wisdom.
Yeah. And it reminds me actually of reading, for instance, of learning to read, that when you have to sound out every word, it's not very fun to read.
Right.
And when you have to sound it out and then you think, I don't know what that word means now that I've sounded it out, that's still not very fun to read. But when you get to the point where you don't think about the act of reading, you think about what's coming out of the reading, you can actively apply those things without conscious attention to the details of what you're doing, then that's when it's fun. Then that's when it's interesting. But you have to go through that precise stage, the tedious part, to get to this stage of freedom, of expertise. And that this way you are prepared to be an active force in the world. And that's why he thinks this expertise is so important, because then you are prepared for life. And he says on page 219, the whole educational affair, is merely a preparation for battling with the immediate experiences of life, a preparation by which to qualify each immediate moment with relevant ideas and appropriate actions. So maybe, I don't know if it's that he's gone through so many wars that he uses all these military metaphors.
I was just thinking about our students who wanted warrior skills.
Yeah.
And then it's like you have to be prepared to fight at any moment in a constantly shifting situation.
It reminds me of Castiglione, right? That Castiglione's courtier had to be effortless. He had to get to the point where he could do all these things without showing that it was any work. And so I think that's a sign of expertise, right? When you're so good at something that you don't have to think about it anymore, then you have developed expertise in that area.
Which makes me feel very inadequate in life, because it makes me wonder, okay, and I need to sit down and think about, what am I really an expert at that I do without having to think about?
I think it's a
and
lot
what
of
do
things.
I really have to work on?
Well, but think about, the things that you're an expert, you don't pay attention to anymore. We're experts at talking in English, right?
Right.
We're experts at walking. We don't have to think about how we do that. Most of us have expertise in other things, like basic math skills, reading, for instance, that it doesn't require that conscious effort anymore. And so then there's room to develop new expertises. And like he says, that you could be in different stages with different subject matter. That you may say, you know what, I've really developed the expertise at speaking English, but now I'm going to learn now I'm very interested in learning how to speak
Arabic.
Yeah, Arabic, for instance. And I'm only at the stage of romance level with that. I'm just learning a few words. I'm just trying some things out. I know that if I'm ever going to get good at this, I'm going to have to go through the gauntlet of precision.
And that's going to be hard, and that's going to be the test to see if I stick with it.
Right.
Yeah.
But then if you do, then you can develop expertise in that too. And I think that, recognizing that this stage of generalization does not mean that you know everything, but that you are, and that you have the tools, you have the weapons to deal with whatever comes at you.
He doesn't say this in ways that other people have, but he talks about learning to love learning. That is the romantic stage, but it's kind of assumed later that you love learning, and so you want to become an expert
Right.
in things. Perhaps comes from his life in academia. I don't know, but there's this idea that people, once you've gone through the precision stage, which is the stage where you're in school, according to him, right?
Yeah.
Then you're moving on. So the stage of generalization could be, in the workforce. It could be in further schooling. It could be in just areas of interest. Yeah, it is the rest of your life. The rest of your life is a learning experience.
And he really puts that in perspective when he reminds teachers that that teachers are only subordinate elements in the education of a person, right? That what happens in school is only a small part of someone's education. And so we get the job of the precision part. Maybe that's why so many people complain. We
in the
get
not
the
fun
job
part.
of precision, of the hard mental discipline, but then that leads to ultimate freedom. Because once you know how to do something, then it can be fun. Then you can use it in active and interesting ways. So one of his main points early on is that this is the process of education has a big overarching goal. He says there is only one subject matter for education, and that is life in all its manifestations. I guess that's a military metaphor, fighting against whatever battles, whatever things life might throw at you, but that ultimately everything we learn has to become transformed into our life, has to become part of who we are and how we live, or else it's not useful to us. It won't matter to us.
Right, it's not meaningful. And this was a conversation you and I were having earlier, but it seems like in many ways that's what all of these readings have been. They have been more than readings about, well, this is what we think about education,
right.
But it's really been readings about, well, this is life. This is how to live your life well. This
right.
is what makes a meaningful life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we hope that stretches beyond UF 100.